Good afternoon. My name is Nicholas Salmon. I'm the director for the Center for the Study of the United States. I'd like to welcome you to An American Coup, Reflections on Trumpism and the January 6th Insurrection. I'm going to say a few words about that and then we'll begin. Today, as many of you know, is Martin Luther King Day in the United States, a day when we celebrate a great hero of civil rights. And I think it's appropriate that we have this meeting today so that we can reflect on the relationship between what we witnessed on January 6th and the March on Washington in 1963, the second March on Washington in 1968, a March on Selma, and Martin Luther King's work in Memphis, which is where he was assassinated, and his efforts to see all American people enfranchised, all American people involved in the great experiment that is the United States. And we will be talking about that, at least in relation to this insurrection, which some people have viewed as an attempt to disenfranchise recently enfranchised Americans. And so I'm assuming we'll hear more about that. There's not one single interpretation to this event, and we will hear more than one today. I'd like to begin with the land acknowledgement. The sacred land on which we operate has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Senecat, the Mississaugas of the Credit River, and the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. It is marked by a history of settler colonialism and genocide, as well as resistance. It is a site from which ongoing internal and external colonial projects are launched and extended, even as their persistence and violence is erased in dominant accounts of history, especially accounts of the present day. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Two-Row Wampum says we are going to live on this land together and respect each other's sovereignty. The Dish with One Spoon is an agreement that recognizes that we live off of the same resources. It is hard to eat a collective meal together off a dish with one spoon. Hence, protocols are put in place to ensure mutual respect and accountability to each other and to the land. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. Our intersection communities are comprised of those native to this land, Indigenous people from other territories, as well as settlers who have come here by choice, force, or otherwise a result of settler colonialism and imperialism. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission 94 calls to action reaffirms that the treaties with Indigenous people must be lawfully honored. We are all treaty peoples and are all responsible for honoring and upholding these agreements. We are grateful for the opportunity to work on this territory and to share space with you. And we say this acknowledgement in lieu of reparations. There are upcoming events at the Center for the Study of the United States that I'm very excited about. This Thursday from 5:30 p.m. to 8 p.m., we will be screening the movie The Infiltrators and then having a conversation with filmmakers Cristina Ibarra and Alex Rivera. Please join us for that. On February 11th from 3:30 p.m. to 5 p.m., the first of our graduate student workshops, Cristina Pasqua, will be speaking about graphic novels. And our 2021 Bisselhead Public Research Event, Racisms in the United States, will take place from March 11 through March 25 on 3 subsequent days. So please turn out for these, and there'll be more information about each of these, and registration information is available at the CSUS website. Look forward to seeing you there all. Now I would like to turn everything over to Max. Oh, one more thing. If you have comments or questions, please use the Q&A feature. You will not be able to use the chat feature. So when we get to the end of the presentations, we welcome robust conversation, and that can happen in the Q&A feature. Okay, now I'd like to bring in Max Mishler, who will be introducing his fellow panelists. And I will step aside and allow the event to begin. It's a pleasure to be here. I look forward to hearing the conversation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Nick, for the welcome and introduction. Thanks to everyone for joining us today for what we hope will be a interesting and productive conversation, chance for us to take stock of where we are, how we got here, and where we might be heading. You know, I think by now we all know what happened, right? On January 6th, following a Trump rally in Washington, D.C., the president's supporters stormed the Capitol building on the orders, in some cases, of Trump and his allies to stop the certification of Joe Biden's election. Several of these participants were planning to and prepared to capture and kill politicians. They destroyed property. They vandalized the Capitol. And at least 5 people have died as a result of this attack, including 1 police officer directly and another indirectly. And in thinking about how we wanted to make sense of this, we quickly came up with this title, An American Coup, Reflections on Trumpism and the January 6th Insurrection. And we thought it would be important to use the word coup and to use the word insurrection to kind of flag one possible interpretation of what is transpiring. I think it's important to remember that while January 6th is a date, the January 6th is not past. We are in the middle of January 6th, by which I mean January 6th is an event in the sense that it has a history. There are processes and events and decisions that led up to it, and it has a future in which it's shaping the world around us. I want to just sort of, before I introduce folks that are going to talk and explain how the format will work, I want to just say a little bit about what this event is not going to be. We didn't market this as a definitive account of what happened on January 6th or a sort of hot take that's going to answer all of our various questions. We are neither so arrogant to think that we could do that, nor do we think it's productive. I think everyone here on the panel rather sees that this is a time for us to start having conversations and to have a kind of maybe reality check about where we are, not only in the United States and in Canada, but globally with the threat of right-wing nationalism. So what we'll do is we'll have each presenter talk for about 7 to 10 minutes. Then we're gonna kind of open it up for a conversation amongst us briefly, and then we'll go to the Q&A. And I'm really pleased with the folks we have today. In some ways, when I thought of this event, I sort of, as we were putting it together, I said, these are precisely the 3 people I would want to hear from about how do we make sense of what happened on January 6th. So we have with us, in order of how they're going to speak, Professor Russell Kazal in the Graduate Department of History at the University of Toronto, and also at the University of Toronto Scarborough as an undergraduate appointment. And I should say that Professor Kazal and myself were also sort of maybe started this conversation last semester when we had a discussion about doing history in the time of right-wing nationalism. And so this is unfortunately, much of what we said, I think, has been borne out in some cases following that discussion. Following Professor Kazal will be Professor Julilly Kohler-Hausman of Cornell, Associate Professor of Cornell University. And after her will be myself, Max Mishler, Assistant Professor here at the University of Toronto. And last but not least, we're going to give the last word to Professor Alexandra Rahr, who's the Bissell-Hayde Graduate Fellow at the Center for Study of the United States. So we'll start in that order, and then we'll proceed. So Russ, why don't you take it away?
Great, thanks. So good afternoon. First, I do want to thank Max for organizing this event, and the Center for the Study of the United States and the Munk School for sponsoring it. And it is a pleasure to be able to meet Julilly and Nick and Alexandra as part of this panel. Max and I go back a ways, but it's great to meet everyone else here. So I think it's fair to say that we were all stunned by President Trump's incitement of a mob attack on the US Capitol on January 6th. But like many people, I really can't say I'm surprised. There's been a lot of discussion about what to call that attack. And for my money, the best description was given by Fiona Hill, the former NSC staffer who testified at Trump's first impeachment trial, and she's now at the Brookings Institution. And she wrote this in Politico in a really perceptive piece. And she called the attack on the Capitol the culmination of, quote, a slow motion, in plain sight attempt at a self-coup, unquote. Trump directed a mob of supporters to march in the Capitol to at the least stop the certification of electoral votes that would make Joe Biden the next president, and ideally to intimidate Vice President Mike Pence into exceeding his constitutional authority by blocking that certification. But as Hill argues, this was just what turns out to have been the final step in Trump's campaign to hold on to power, that is, to carry out a self-coup, right? So a coup is when you try to seize power. A self-coup is to retain power you already have. Trump's attempt at a self-coup began at the latest on November 4th, on election night, when he falsely claimed victory while crying election fraud on the part of Democrats. The 60-some lawsuits that his campaign and hangers-on subsequently filed to overturn Biden's victory in battleground states, and Trump's bullying of state and local election officials and state legislators in Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere, these were all part of this rolling coup attempt. As Hill notes, the keys to a successful coup, and she studied a lot of coups around the world when she was at the NSC, she has sort of a checklist of what makes for a coup. She says the keys to a successful coup include mobilizing some popular support, but also gaining control of the following: the military, communications, the courts, government institutions, and the legislature. Now, Trump failed, although not for want of trying, in most of these areas. But he did convince millions of Americans that the election was stolen from him, and he raised a mob on that conviction. And the opening for that mob was made possible by his enablers in the legislature, that is, in Congress, above all Senators Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz. Their groundless objections to certified electoral votes from Pennsylvania and other states gave that mob false hope that a reversal was possible. So these legislators, and Hawley's in particular, they helped to open the door to the mob, almost literally helped to open that door. And the reasons Hawley gave for objecting are really telling. Hawley argued, among other things, that a Pennsylvania law loosening restrictions on mail-in voting violated that state's constitution. In other words, this particular objection was not about alleged voter fraud. It was about a measure passed to make voting more accessible. Now, maybe I'm a bit sensitive on this point because I voted by mail in Pennsylvania in this election. My wife Deb and I mailed our civilian overseas ballots to the Montgomery County Board of Elections in September. And Montgomery County is a suburban county of Philadelphia. So Josh Hawley was talking about us, right? He's talking about me. But for anyone who's followed American politics for the last 2 decades, Hawley's objection to mail-in voting sounded very familiar. It was of a piece with a much larger campaign of voter suppression waged by the Republican Party at the state and federal level over that period. Trump's slow-motion self-coup was enabled in part by Republican federal and state legislators, party officials, and lawyers who cried fraud, but whose accusations tended to wither in the courts, and they would wither in the courts down to allegations that mail-in voting might be open to fraud. And of course, as the New York Times pointed out, such accusations of fraud resembled those Republicans have pushed in a dozen states to justify voter ID laws, aggressive purges of voter rolls, and other measures targeting likely Democratic voters. And of course, these are measures that target, above all, Black and Latino voters, whose growing numbers Republicans perceive as a demographic threat. Those Republican lawmakers, like Hawley and like a good number of Pennsylvania state legislators, those who facilitated Trump's attempted coup, were therefore taking actions deeply rooted in the larger recent history of voter suppression. But their actions also point to a profoundly anti-democratic stance, a rejection of majority rule, and a comfort with ruling as a political minority, a stance that likewise has deep historical roots in American conservatism. Now, a distrust of democratic majorities is at least as old as the American Republic itself. It influenced the framers of the US Constitution. They created a government under which voters directly elected only the House of Representatives, not the president or the Senate. The Senate originally is elected by state legislatures. It's only in 1913 that a constitutional amendment makes direct election of senators possible. Efforts to counter majorities include, of course, a long and honorable tradition of protecting the rights of racial and religious minorities against oppressive majorities. defenses of what Kyle Volk calls the rights of, quote, moral minorities, unquote, those defenses date to the early 19th century. As to, I should say, date defenses of slavery as the interest of a political minority in the South. And this, of course, is John C. Calhoun's theory of concurrent majorities. Yet modern anti-majoritarianism as a rejection of political rule by democratic majorities, that has been largely a province of the right. In the South, of course, Jim Crow meant minority rule by a white Democratic Party in those areas with Black majorities. And this could be entire states before the 1930s, like Mississippi. As George Nash has argued, conservatism as an intellectual movement in the 1950s was predominantly anti-majoritarian. Its libertarian and traditionalist strains, and these are represented by figures like Frank Meyer and Russell Kirk, these stood for principles like checks and balances, a dispersal of power, and limits on majorities. Not until the later 1960s would many conservatives make the populist move of identifying with a so-called silent majority. Rick Perlstein, writing in 2013, described an enduring conservative penchant for minoritarianism. Quote, the conviction that conservatives are fit to rule even if they don't actually win elections, unquote. And Perlstein pointed to efforts here in 1956 and 1960 by conservative activists to run third-party presidential candidates as spoilers in those general elections. The idea here was to reduce the electoral vote count of the main parties by enough to throw those elections into the House of Representatives, where right-wing congressmen could bargain for concessions. Now, historians have more work to do to trace possible continuities between minoritarian thought and practice in the mid-20th century and the minoritarian strain in today's Republican Party, although Perlstein and also Nancy McLean have pointed to some very intriguing evidence here. What can be said, though, is that even when much conservative rhetoric shifted in a majoritarian direction during and after the 1970s, conservative and Republican operatives thought in terms of pushing for a smaller and wider electorate. As the new right activist Paul Weyrich famously told a gathering of religious leaders in Dallas in 1980, quote, I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of the people. Our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down, unquote. 2 years later, in 1982, a federal court banned the Republican Party, the National Party, from waging campaigns against alleged voter fraud without court approval. And the court did this after it found evidence of the party intimidating non-white voters in the name of preventing fraud. So if that sounds familiar, it goes a long way back. That ban lasted until 2018. Right? It kept getting renewed as courts kept finding repeated examples of this by the National Party. So Republican attempts at voter suppression in the name of a purer electorate are nothing new. Neither is minoritarian thinking on the right. What is quite striking is what seems to me an increased willingness not simply to keep people from voting, but to throw their votes out after the election is over. You saw a version of this in North Carolina in 2016 and in Wisconsin in 2018. In both states, a Republican-controlled legislature voted to limit the powers of a newly elected Democratic governor. Basically, they voted to strip his office of significant power once a Republican no longer controlled it. And this was basically a way to devalue a choice that voters had made. It was a fairly explicit form of minority rule. I would argue that what we saw this past December was a fusing of this kind of minoritarian impulse with Trump's slow motion coup attempt. A number of Rubicons were crossed in the past 2 months, and the attack on the Capitol was only the most recent one. Almost as stunning, in a way even more stunning, was the willingness of elected politicians to throw out after the election the electoral vote, not just of other states, but of their own state. And of course, we saw the State Attorney General of Texas try to throw out Pennsylvania's votes through a bogus lawsuit. But here you've got a case of Republican lawmakers in Pennsylvania trying to throw out their own state's votes. On December 3rd, the Republican leadership of the Pennsylvania legislature confirmed in a memo that that body had no authority to ignore the certified results of the election in Pennsylvania, the results it gave Joe Biden the state, and therefore had no power to name the state's electors themselves, as Trump had asked them to do. And in this memo on December 3rd, they said that to do that would, quote, set a precedent that a simple majority of the General Assembly can override the will of the people as evidenced by the popular vote, unquote. 1 day later, after hearing from Rudy Giuliani, they turned around, the Republican leadership did. They sent a letter to the state's congressional delegation asking them to perform this service instead. That is, to object to their own state's election results and to push Congress to overturn them. So the state Republican leadership in the legislature in Pennsylvania was asking Pennsylvania congressmen, members of Congress, to object to the state's certified returns. In other words, under pressure from Trump, that Republican state leadership was willing to override the will of the people. Now, again, maybe I find this particularly shocking because, after all, this is my vote they wanted to throw out, mine along with those of 6.9 million other Pennsylvanians. But that December 4th letter from the legislative leaders strikes me as about as explicit an endorsement of minority rule as it's possible to get. And the shock here is not that Trump was able to raise a mob of QAnon conspiracy theorists and white supremacists on January 6th. You know, that doesn't really surprise me. The shock for me is that he was able to bring the legislative leadership of an American state to advocate something that they said the day before they knew they shouldn't advocate, that is, to override the will of the people. Trump may be gone in 2 days. He may be gone by January 20th. But those legislators, that state Republican leadership, will still be there in Harrisburg. And I have to ask myself, to that extent, did Trump's self-coup against American democracy, against the rule of the majority, succeed? Thanks.
Thank you, Russell. So now we'll go to Julilly.
Julie, you're muted.
Total rookie move. Sorry. Thank you all so much for including me in this conversation. And I'm really grateful for this particular forum, and really any forum, but particularly these people to discuss what's going on. I really appreciate Max starting by saying that we do not have like definitive takes right now, because I wouldn't feel comfortable doing that. I also think in part this is because I think we're learning. I mean, every day we learn more about what actually happened. I think and I also think there's sort of a psychological processes that's happening slowly about us just really absorbing, even just hearing Max say just now that there were people who were intent on assassinating the vice president. It just continues to sort of sink in that that's the reality. And I think that hinders our ability to sort of digest and analyze. I think we just have to be candid about that. The challenge for thinking about the Trump presidency, I think for historians, or at least for me, has always been balancing the sort of exceptional with the continuity. The need to capture the depravity, the incompetence, the corruption, the racism, the violence, just the incredible ferocity of these things manifesting in this presidency, with the ways that Trump emerges, as I think we're all, in some ways very maybe predictably, from long streams deep in US history. So for 5 years, I think we've all been sort of trying to do this dance to think of how to think about Trump as a symptom and how to think of Trump as the disease. And I think this challenge is even more acute in the wake of January 6th, when the events were so extreme and the images so shocking that we so want to talk about it, and in a lot of ways they are unprecedented, to talk in terms of newness. Desperate need to mark this apart, to signal it as a bridge too far, and to really grapple with the deadly severity of this moment. And I truly believe that this is a deadly serious moment. But I also think there's a trap but we also have to acknowledge that for many, many Americans, this fascist face, this sort of authoritarian state of sort of vigilante violence, is not new. It's something that has been facing many Black people, trans people, particularly people that have been involved in activism, for a very, very long time. I mean, we hear reports of some of the members of the squad in Congress, turning to their colleagues who are telling them how scared they are and saying, I've had a death mark on my back from this president for years, and so, I mean, this is really the challenge of when we think about this. So so I want to talk in my remaining time about sort of historical roots and about precedent, but really with a sort of caveat that this isn't to suggest, I don't want to walk away from the feeling of how sort of deadly in particular this particular moment is also. But I do think that that sort of impulse for analysis does demand that we really think about historical continuities. And I'm really building on the comments that came right before me, which I think are so brilliant and helpful, and I think they work really well together. So I'm actually have been writing a book for 4 years now about basically the politics of voter fraud and the politics of voter suppression, or sort of fights, the politicization of electoral regulations. I did not ever think that these issues would come to be as forefront as they are now, and sometimes I'm happy about that, and sometimes I'm a little disoriented. But so what I wanted to think about today is sort of think about continuity in terms of this big lie, the big lie of voter fraud. And I've been trying to think, and again, I want to present this as sort of a provocation, because I'm still really struggling with this, about why this particular lie is so potent, and why it's so salient. Like, why does this lie work? I mean, I think we can't just believe that any lie would be as powerful. So obviously this lie works because it rationalizes voter suppression, many of the things that Russell just mentioned. But I think, and I don't actually think it's really that interesting or confusing why politicians would want to pick their own voters, right? Like, I mean, like in numerical terms, it's equally as efficient for politicians to block an opponent's vote as to mobilize the supporters. I think what's more interesting to me, or what's less clear, is how these actions are not more perilous or costly in a political culture that sanctifies democracy and incessantly champions American democracy as like all the sort of creedal mythology that Americans embrace often. So why is voter suppression and these lies not more toxic politically, and why do they resonate so broadly? And here I really think that the answer lies within American democracy, and within the practice of American democracy and the tradition of American democracy, or part of the answer anyway. And I find myself wondering, like, maybe the question arising from January 6th is not so much like whether U.S. democracy can survive Trump, which, by the way, is a really powerful frame circulating in like cable news, but whether Americans are actually that into democracy. I mean, and what really, or to put it a little bit more sort of with a little bit more nuance, which is like, what is the nature of the commitment to American democracy in U.S. political culture, because obviously, and this goes without saying, way before Trump, there was a deliberately counter-majoritarian electoral college, a Senate, extreme levels of legalized corruption, that is our campaign finance system. There's the disenfranchisement of residents of Washington, D.C., 3.5 million residents who live in Guam, Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, America Samoa, and the Northern Mariana Islands. Millions more are disenfranchised because of felon convictions. For decades, the voter participation rates in presidential races was barely over half of the public, and U.S. political history has always been as much a fight over sculpting the electorate as it is about fights over ideas and the loyalty of different constituencies, and so. When I think about this, the salience of the lie of voter fraud, I think I kind of think about two political trends, two historical trends that are, I'm gonna have to go over them pretty quickly, that I think are worth mentioning. The first is declining faith in the state that intensified in the late 20th century, and the second is what I call conditional citizenship. And the first is that I think to understand the sort of wide acceptance of this of voter fraud, we have to understand in the context of the attacks on the competency and the capacity of the state to intervene and to deliver services in a fair manner. And I think that this has been more discussed, so I'm not going to say a lot about it. I want to kind of move through this quickly. But obviously, Trump's attacks on election apparatus resonated in part because it built upon decades of politicians questioning and undermining, and of course, fiscally starving state institutions. And I think that this sort of lack of faith in the state to actually do things competently or do things fairly is really built in tandem with this idea that the state serves the wrong people. And that this is a politics that's been building, it's been around for a long time, but really a lot since the civil rights era, and has been manufactured in powerful ways through anti-Black, anti-welfare, and crime politics. The idea that the state is not just incompetent and incapable, but it also is not serving you. And I think you see a lot of resonances of that stream of discourse in this anti-fraud discourse. And the second thing that I want to sort of introduce, and maybe we can talk about more later, is that I would argue that there's a deep trend in US political culture that takes voting to be a privilege. That this idea that it's a universal right is really not borne out by, I think, American political culture. And I think a lot of us actually accept much of this. The assumption that the right to legitimate voice within the polity should be revoked or restricted under certain conditions, I think, is actually quite widespread. And in a post-civil rights colorblind era, these logics have been instrumental in rationalizing continuing racial subordination and the logic of disenfranchising and accepting the disenfranchisement or calling for the disenfranchisement of people of color, particularly Black Americans. So what I mean by conditional citizenship is that courts and lawmakers and a percentage of the public defend the tradition of making civic voice and the ability to claim the benefits of citizenship contingent upon proper behavior and fulfilling certain conditions: working, tax-paying, law-abiding. So in terms of voting, this rhetoric insists that while people can't be disenfranchised on the basis of race or gender, they can forfeit their voice through choices, most importantly, breaking the law. Most importantly, felon disenfranchisement, but also more mundane things like failing to register to vote on a certain day or lacking proper identification or skipping multiple elections and getting purged because you can get purged if you don't show up for a number of elections. So in this sense, felon disenfranchisement is not some anomaly or vestige of an older era, but actually really like the symptom of a sort of something that I think we should think of as at the heart of US political culture. And so conditions these conditions on the franchise were always understood as needing to fight fraud, to maintain the purity of the ballot box and the integrity of the electorate. And there's always this blurring between technical fraud, like stuffing the ballot box, and so basically it's blurring between fraudulent votes and fraudulent voters, illegitimate votes and illegitimate voters, people that are insufficiently virtuous, civilized, educated. And I'm not going to have time because I want to wrap up here, but this always serves as a proxy for race in lots of ways that are I think really important to acknowledge. So what I'm suggesting is that voter IDs and all these conditions on the vote that Republicans have been so livid about being challenged, these aren't just to prevent fraud, but they've also served as a civics virtue test, like almost a way of proving that you're a sort of a technology to prove that people are sufficiently virtuous. And so this logic of conditional citizenship, to wrap up, is not new. It's has long buttressed white supremacy, settler colonialism. It rationalized Jim Crow, and I think it really remains deeply resident today. And so, what I'm hoping is that this trauma can be a forum where we can really call the question about the commitment in our broader political culture to a truly egalitarian, multiracial democracy. So thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you so much. All right. So my thoughts are going to be a little bit more scattered and less well presented than the first two. And in part it's because, truthfully, I've had a hard time figuring out what I want to say. It's been a difficult moment for me to go back and forth between my citizen hat, understanding full well that the citizen hat is, as Julilly just laid out, not available to everyone in the same way. Nevertheless, my citizen hat and my scholar hat. So I thought I would want to start by doing something I don't usually do. In fact, I strive to avoid it in most of my teaching, and that is to be unequivocal. President Trump committed crimes. He incited a riot and an insurrection. He should have been impeached. He should be prosecuted. He should be convicted. And even if he's out of office by the time he goes to the Senate, he should be convicted and barred from office. The senators, Cruz and Hawley and others in the Congress who helped bring this attempted coup to fruition should not only be censured, but should be removed and prosecuted and also barred from office. And I want to be unequivocal about that. That's not a scholarly assessment. That's what I believe as a citizen of the United States, that some damage was done on January 6th that needs to be addressed. And my hope is that Democrats and few Republicans who have any soul or conscience left can make that happen. And yet that's not enough to say that. We want to try to understand how we got here and how do we bring about a new political situation in which that doesn't happen again. So I want to start with some bad news. According to, as far as I can tell, I think it was today or yesterday, NBC poll, 87% of Republicans still support Donald Trump. Let's just sit with that for a second. 87% of Republicans saw what happened on January 6th and said, yes. And I think this is important because we have to deal with the fact that, to Julilly's point about exception or continuity, we also have to add this question of anomaly or representative. Donald Trump is representative of the Republican base. And I would say a huge percentage of that base. And we need to if we don't accept that, we're going to have a very difficult time finding a way out of that. And so we're not in a situation in which a minority of Americans that we can discount have anti-democratic politics. We're in a situation where millions and millions of Americans fundamentally don't believe in democracy and believe that if their person doesn't win, that somehow democracy is a sham. And so I think we need to grapple with that. But here's the good news. The good news is that most Americans not only disagree with them, but I would say have been polarized to the left in the last 4 years, and been polarized not just by Trump, but by Black Lives Matter and broader political insurgencies that have taken off during this moment, and also because of the ineptitude of this administration dealing with perhaps the deadliest event in American history since the Civil War, which is the coronavirus pandemic. So that means that not only are most Americans not anti-democratic, but their non-anti-democratic politics is slowly absorbing other political positions that had been on the margins of mainstream politics for many years, such as rethinking policing and incarceration, such as dealing with the legacies of slavery and institutional racism, such as developing a more healthy approach to gender and sexuality equity, and rethinking our immigration policies and immigration detention. So to me, the good news is there is a constituency of Americans that is actually the majority of Americans from which we can build something new on these ruins if we can do it. And this brings me to the scholarly hat. And much of what I'm going to say, I think, echoes what Russell and Julilly have said before, but maybe taking a little bit of a different direction. So if it's the case that most Americans are not like the 87% of Republicans, how do those Republicans have so much power? And the answer lies precisely in what Russell and Julilly have been talking about, this slow motion coup that came before Trump's presidency. And the ways in which that slow motion coup articulates, Julilly used the phrase, declining faith in the state. I'm gonna talk more about the relationship between austerity and anti-democracy, and the hollowing out of the state, right, in a very intentional way. And Nancy McLean's book, Democracy in Chains, I think is a helpful starting point. I know historians have various perspectives on the book, but I think it's a helpful starting point because what she points out is that from a very early period, in fact, in the 60s and 70s, libertarian capitalists realized they could not win democratically. They had to win their policies in an undemocratic fashion. And they went about doing what the left had been talking about doing for decades, but never managed to do, which was building a political coalition that could take over state legislatures en route to taking over the federal government, and they succeeded. They succeeded so much, in fact, that the Democratic Party, which had been the bastion of social democracy and social citizenship well into the 1970s, had a turnaround in the 1980s and became the leading edge of neoliberal austerity. And so there was a hegemony, in some ways, of what Ruthie Gilmore calls the anti-state state, a state whose sole purpose is to provide services and protection for capital, while it eats away at any protection and social services for the rest of us. Now, what does this mean? It means that we need to take Trump seriously as an actual a person, narcissistic terrorist that we have to, take great care with to remove from the political realm. But if we make the mistake of thinking Trumpism, sort of an ideology that he's come to represent, is not deeply, deeply, structurally present in American politics and will not outlive him, then we're making a grave mistake. This thing will last a lot longer because, as we saw, it took an attempted coup for some corporations to even start to walk back. That's what it took. And we need to remember something else about Trump's presidency, and perhaps it counts for the 87%. Trump's presidency was incredibly successful. He cut taxes, rolled back regulations. He's done exactly what the Republican Party has been trying to do for years, and was able to do it in part because of the popular support that he was able to mobilize. So he's incredibly successful. Okay. Now, 3 more thoughts and then I'll stop. And it builds on something Julilly said about what is democracy really in America? Is democracy the norm? And I would say no. Well, first of all, we have to remember that the founders never intended to build a democracy, right? They wanted a republic. So democracy is historically, it's not an opinion, it is historically the product of struggles between groups of people in this country over who has the right to make decisions. And for most of that time, most people in the country were excluded from democracy. And so we can think of American history, or the long arc that Martin Luther King talked about, was the efforts of people who had been excluded from a political process to get into the political process and to have their voices heard. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is that, we tend to think of violence, which the coup represented, as exceptional in American history, but it is not. And I tend, and Stephen Hahn right now is writing a book called The Illiberal Tradition in America. And part of what he's trying to argue is that the violence of Reconstruction, or the violence of January 6th, or the violence of the Nixon administration, if we stop seeing these as anomalous and start seeing them as central to the fabric of democracy, we'll get a better sense of what it is we're talking about when we say American democracy. Okay. Two thoughts on this from my perspective as someone who writes about mass incarceration and about social movements. I want to suggest, and this is where I may be taking in a different direction, I think the events of January 6th pose a real problem for historians of mass incarceration in particular, and for the left broadly conceived in the United States. And they pose 2 problems because of assumptions of those groups of people. Now, with the exception of our esteemed guest panelists, Julilly, and a few other people I can think of, Elizabeth Hinton, Khalil Muhammad, a few others, there has been a tendency among scholars of mass incarceration to do 2 things that I think are unfortunate. One, they collapse all differences between conservatives and liberals, between Republicans and Democrats, and because of the very thing that we've noted, that under Clinton and other Democrats, neoliberal austerity has been the policy, they've made this argument that there's no difference. And if there's no difference, in some ways, the implication would be that there's no reason to engage in political struggle, and there's no reason to think about how one might utilize those differences to achieve different ends. I think this is part of why historians of mass incarceration have had a hard time dealing not only with Trump in particular, but dealing with the events of January 6th. They don't know what to do with it because you can't explain it if there's no difference, right? So I think we need to be a little bit more careful as scholars of mass incarceration when we talk about the liberal origins of mass incarceration or the role of the Democratic Party. We not become sociologists and say this is what is, but rather we say why in this moment where Democrats and liberals pushed or encouraged to take positions right? Or how were they defeated versus they were the same thing as Nixon law and order. Two, there's a tendency in studies of mass incarceration to see the state as all wrong. Not just that there's been a declining ability of the state to deliver services, but that the state is itself a predatory, violent structure that can never be used for good ends. And you're seeing this now with how everyone is responding to the repression of the instigators of the coup, or the use of police to prosecute people, that there's this concern that, well, if we're against policing writ large, how can we possibly support an effort to police white supremacy? So I think scholars who take the position that there is no place for a state in mediating conflicts and providing resources to citizens are going to have a very hard time dealing with what makes the Trump presidency exceptional and how do we deal with it. The state is a terrain of struggle. It does not exist on its own. Right? And we have to be careful, I think, not to fall into the trap of believing every effort at repressing the right will necessarily be bad for left or progressive forces because repression against one is repression against all. That's not true historically. Repression against the Klan in the South was not necessarily the same thing as repression against Black power. There are connections, but we have to tease out those connections. This brings me to my second point, the problem of liberal democracy for the left. And these are connected points. Because Julilly, you framed the question as, what is American democracy? But from, I think, a left perspective, and here obviously I'm self-identifying myself a bit, what is democracy to the left? And I think we have a real problem here. I think that if democracy is either A, nothing but a veneer for the exploitation of capitalism, or B, nothing but an inheritance of capitalism, i.e. the child of capitalism, then there's nothing left to do except circumvent democracy to lobby for more progressive policies. That's an anti-democratic politics. And I think the left has to be very careful about not making those kinds of arguments, especially in the wake of an attempted coup. I think the left as a project must be wary of a democracy fetish, where we just keep saying the word, but we don't think about what it means. But neither of those two statements is correct. Democracy is not just a veneer for capitalism, nor is it a child of capitalism. Democracy is the product of real struggles between real people in real moments for control over power and resources. And we have to be in the midst of that struggle. And I think I'll end here. Moments like January 6th should clarify for anyone who considers themselves broadly on the left, that is, people concerned with anti-racist, socialist, feminist, anti-imperialist politics, anti-war politics. We have to fight like hell for democracy. We have to fight for the terrain of struggle, and we have to claim democracy, yes, liberal democracy, as our terrain. And I think we have to carefully assess our own tendencies historically to advocate for coups and insurrections. This tendency looks cute in hindsight. In fact, many of us write about it. We valorize efforts of previous generations to launch insurrections. I think we need to be careful about how we tell those stories and connect those stories to the present. I'm not opposed to it, but we have to be clear what the implications are. Or do we just not like the insurrections on the right? Because that's inconsistent. And it's an inconsistency that most Americans don't like, including many of the Americans in communities we claim to be speaking for and on their behalf. Last thing, what is the obligation of the historian or the scholar on the left today? Given this, I think we need to take the lead from those elected officials of color. Some call them the squad. You can think more capaciously about it if you want. Those people, Cori Bush, people who have said exactly what I'm saying better, more eloquently, and have actually done something about it. They said the Democratic Party and liberal democracy is the terrain of struggle. It's the place where we're going to make a difference. We're going to push it to the left and fight like hell to build a more democratic society through the institutions that we have. I think our job, even as critics who are intimately aware of the failings of the Democratic Party, our job is to take the lead of those activists of color who have taken the charge in our moment for democracy, much like activists of color took the charge for democracy in the 1960s, 1930s, 1920s, 1890s, 1860s, 1830s, 1810s, 1790s, right? Those on the margins of society have always been able to see clearly the importance of democracy, and why we have to wage our fights in it. So that'll be, I'll leave it there. I apologize for the preachiness of it, but in part, as I mentioned, I've been struggling to figure out how to speak in a scholarly tone about something that feels very unscholarly. So I'm gonna stop there. I'll pass it to Alexandra briefly. I mispronounced your title, Alexandra. I just want to give you the correct title. Alexandra is the Bissell-Hay Lecturer at the Center for the Study of the United States. So I'll pass it to you now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Max. And thanks to Russ and to Julilly as well. Really, I just want to add my chorus to what feels like a kind of building piece of music that we're constructing here, and echo a lot of what you've said. So I want to talk today about the consequences of what we can think of as a kind of culture of singularity, which several of you have pointed to already, right? So the repeated attempts to convince citizens to think of January 6th, the long January 6th, right, as Max pointed out, as an aberration. And I want to spend a few minutes on this because what has frequently happened in the last 10 days or so is that we acknowledge that this attempted coup isn't singular. But then we kind of move on quickly without thinking about exactly why such cultural amnesia is a problem. So I want to dwell there for a few minutes and think about some of those consequences. This kind of thinking, this kind of imaginary, I see as being part of the disaster imaginary. What happens when the Republic is confronted with a catastrophe, with an emergency? And I just want to cover some familiar ground and say, you know, we traditionally see catastrophe as a breach, right? We see it as anomalous. In the American tradition, disaster is imagined as aberrant. It's unprecedented. And that means, of course, without precedent. The events of January 6th have been presented in the days since quite often as explicitly ahistorical, right? It suggests that nothing like this has ever come before, that the insurrection has no ancestry, that it has no analogs, right? It has no fellows, no kin that accompanies it or preceded it. And importantly, none which will follow, no descendants. Right, that these kinds of events and that this insurrection in particular have no past, but also have no futurity. And so that means we can't learn from it, right? Because nothing follows from it. This is entirely typical of disaster thinking, by the way. We do the same thing with hurricanes. We do it with floods. We do it with epidemics. You know, we're doing it right now. So I just want to spend a few minutes by thinking about who benefits. We want to think about who benefits from public forgetting, right? Which subjects or which politics are privileged by this amnesia, and how and to what end. So it's really worth noting here that the insurrection and that the attempts to relegate it to a singularity, to strip it of its power, as Julilly mentioned, as a signal, as a signifier, as a symptom, you know, to use medical language here, to insist that it is subclinical, that insistence on its singularity is troubling. Because of course, as we know, January 6 events didn't emerge from nowhere. And many commentators have noted this in the past 10 days. One I want to point you to is Clint Smith III, an emerging scholar who wrote a great article in The Atlantic, situating the photograph of the rioter carrying the flag of the Confederacy, and behind him, reading the portraits that were behind him, right, with this remarkable history of abolitionism and pro-slavery. So I also want to echo that this was not an emergence this violence did not emerge accidentally, and that the insistence, not quite on the meaninglessness, but on the really narrowly delimited meaning, what we can think of as a kind of trope of insignificance, which I think we can call it now after so many hours of coverage and so many thousands of words that have been written and tweeted, that this insistence that this was an insignificant event, that it has no descendants and it has no precedent. I want to talk about a couple of examples of that and what they mean. So here's how that trope works. Think here about the emphasis on the cosplay elements, right, of Vikings and others on January 6th rather than on the organized, deliberative, planned nature of this event. It is absolutely worth mentioning, as Max did, that the insurrectionists came on that day to that place because members of Congress were gathered to tabulate and confirm the Electoral College's votes as required by law, that they came in numbers to stop the legislative confirmation of a fair election. So we should be attentive to accounts that represent the violence of January 6th as random, as simply mob rule, right? People got carried away. Sometimes this has been depicted in the last 10 days as the hive mind at work. Another example of this insistence on the insignificance, the sort of orphan nature, the genetic isolate nature of January 6th. Sort of cutesy, naughty, bad boy readings of rioters sitting with their feet up on Nancy Pelosi's desk, seeing this as a violation of decorum and not one of law. And I'd just like to remind you here of the just remarkable history of how manners and civility have been deployed in the Trump era. This is now a trope of its own, one which Bourdieu, among many others, would have something to say about. So we can think here about the kind of, we've seen this many times throughout the Trump era, the sort of rueful acknowledgement by Republicans or conservatives, where in which they say, look, we can all agree that Trump's behavior is impolite, that his supporters may be rude, that he's crass, but that's just a matter of politesse. And smart, reflective, adult citizens like you can recognize the difference between speech and action. Boys will be boys is another way to articulate the same theory. And so grabbing women by the pussy is recast as locker room talk, right? And not criminal assault. So I don't need to explicate for you here the deep layers of gender normativity and also class work that are being done in these moments, how the boundaries of the acceptable are policed in ways which echo the attacks on so-called political correctness and on cancel culture. But I just want to mention that it's really important to pay attention in Trump world to what is permitted to signify as a metaphor and what is not, to what is forced into what we can think of as a kind of violent literalism. So that bragging about sexual assault is just a figure of speech, but armed insurrection, that's just protest. It doesn't signify anything, right? It doesn't signify beyond itself. It's nothing beyond misbehavior. And what that leaves us with, of course, is a culture of personal responsibility. And we can see that in the patterns of arrest so far, in which individuals have been arrested for vandalism, for entering the Capitol. And we want to think about the juridical power here to think more broadly, to insist upon signification and significance, and to place collective charges, right, against insiders, organizers, and funders of the event. To recognize that criminality created the mob. It's not just about the individuals who formed it. And that would be a use of law that would correct the insistence that this event was an aberration, that it does not signal beyond itself or beyond a handful of wayward fringe citizens. So I know we're out of time here, and so I just want to wrap up quickly by pointing you towards a couple of examples that I think really work hard towards correcting this trope of insignificance or the insistence on these as isolated events. One is Ed Baptist's 2014 book, Ed Baptist from Cornell, The Half Has Never Been Told, in which he says, we think about and teach enslavement all wrong. Enslavement doesn't stand outside of American capitalism. It's not a horrific exception. It is the apex of extractive, efficient, profitable capitalism. And we need to think about it that way and teach about it that way. The other example I want to leave you with is DeRay McKesson and several others who are the co-founders of Project Zero, a project which works to use scholarly research in order to inform actionable policy reducing police violence. And that is a form of thinking and a form of scholarship which resists the notion that these are isolated events, that they don't signify beyond themselves, and instead places us in a deep and a long genealogy and encourages those habits of thinking, as William Cronin says, so that we can all become better readers of this very long January 6th moment. So thank you so much. I can't tell you how much I've learned today. Thank you, Max, for organizing this.
My pleasure. So we're gonna get into the questions in a second. I just wanted to start by seeing if any of the panelists have any either thoughts or responses to maybe what some of the other folks have said before we move into the Q&A.
I have so many thoughts. I don't even know where to start.
Yes.
That's like a total trick question, Max. I feel like this was so rich. I mean, and I feel like we should try to like, don't worry, I'm not actually recommending people take on writing assignments in this chaos, but I feel like there was like a bunch of threads that are just so profitably thought about together. So I don't even know which way to go, but I do feel like this question that's kind of coming up is of like, what is I feel like, I mean, Max, you were saying this, but it came out, I thought about this when all of us spoke, that I feel like that we've all been part of this. We've been, at least in the US, like sort of cable news, but so many other places, there's just been this insistence that our democracy is a thing. And I just feel like our democracy is at stake. Our democracy has been threatened. Our democracy has been imperiled. And I do have this feeling of like, I don't know if any of us have a shared understanding of what that means, you know. And like, I mean, in this sort of, and this brings to your point about sort of like what the 6th signifies, you know, and it signifies this breach of this thing, but I just feel like both of these things need to be thought together. Like, what's been violated? I don't know that we have a collective shared, we sort of fetishize this word, but I'm not sure that we have a fetishized, I'm sure that we have a shared understanding of what American democracy is or should be. And I sometimes wonder, like, I often will say something is anti-democratic, but I think sometimes that's slippery, because I think there's a lot of people that are doing things that we would call anti-democratic, that they would, like, I think a lot of people that stormed the Capitol would say that they were doing it in the name of democracy. So again, this is where sort of our critique and our analysis might have some, might butt up against each other sometimes, because we can point to that and say that was anti-democratic, and it was fundamentally, you know. But on the other hand, there's a sort of lacking of a shared, you know, I mean, but there's those millions of people that Max was speaking to. I don't know, this is partially an empirical question, but I'm not sure what they would say, that they would say that they're that they are against democracy. I think some would, but I think there's a lot of people, and I'd be interested to hear what you think. I genuinely am posing this as a question, who would say this is for democracy. You know, so anyway, that was one thought that came up when I was listening to you all.
Yeah, just to jump in, I think that's exactly right. And I think what this is pointing to is the fundamental two different senses of what reality is that we have, which has been fostered by the big lie, right? That a lot of the people, not necessarily people who broke into the Capitol, but a lot of people in the crowd outside thought they were trying to you know, scotch a fraudulent election, and they were trying to make, you know, live up to American democracy by what they were doing. And they believed that because they had drunk the Kool-Aid, right? They believed it because they believed the alternate reality that Trump was putting out there. And we can ask why they did that and how that worked. And in particular, what are the, now I particularly just loved your explication of notions of the vote as a privilege and who is able, you know, who's allowed to have it and so forth. Because I think that's working in here too in all kinds of different ways. But I agree 100% that you know, what's at issue here in a sense is two different realities that are conflicting, and both in the name of democracy. I will say I think the reality that we seem to believe here is the real one, but right, that's the issue, right? Who thinks it is and who thinks it isn't?
I just add, I mean, I think from the perspective of someone who studies sort of slavery and battles over slavery in the 19th century, that democracy to me is a lot like freedom. right? It's a word that means actually nothing until you fill it with something. But the problem is you can fill it with anything, right? And there's this old debate about whether, were slaveholders in the 19th century being disingenuous when they understood themselves to be inheritors of the American Revolution? No. Were segregationists disingenuous when they understood, when they thought of interventions in the Southern segregation as being anti-democratic? No. They understood those to be incursions on their democratic rights. So we have to, I think, realize that democracy can mean different things to different people, and it's also a moving target. So when you try to nail it down, it can get away from you. Perhaps more uncomfortably, it's not just that the millions of people who still support Trump believe, I think, that they are acting in the name of democracy. I think for all of us, it might be even harder to acknowledge that there are great moments in American history which we think of as liberatory, which were anti-democratic. The key one being Lincoln. Lincoln's administration was one of the most anti-democratic presidential administrations in American history. None of us, at least now, I would say, teach that story that way, right? We teach the abolition of slavery and Reconstruction is one of the great democratic moments in American history. But to get there, Lincoln had to repress some people. He had to put some people in jail. He had to occupy a region. And here we can see in the 60s, the Southern segregationist notion of a Northern occupation of the South, which again, we do ourselves a disservice if we think they're being disingenuous, there's not something to it. So yes, it's like how we see democracy, but also, is it possible that social justice and democracy don't actually always align? That sometimes democracy can be put to the ends of keeping people in chains, of keeping people in cages, of keeping people in contingent citizenship. And so then I think we need to, then it's not just a positive referral, right? It's not a positive reference all the time.
There's just to pick up on that, Max, there's a long and interesting history of the literature of occupation, right, and cultures of occupation. And the question of these important cultural questions of how do people not just understand themselves, but how are they culturally represented as being occupied or occupiers? And very often that is a question that is as cultural as it is political. It's not so much, it's often articulated in terms of things like language and foodways, right? And we still see all of that now, right? The oppression of, traditional ways of being as an expression of oppression and unfreedom, right? Of illiberalism, especially within the kind of diverse melting pot model of the Republic. So I'm interested in the ways in which this political and often explicitly electorally political discussion also has this other sort of shadow side where a lot of this gets played out in something like country music, right? Is a place where we see a lot of this contemporary country music that gets played out a lot, especially over the last 15 years.
One question I have, and then if you guys have any other responses or any other comments, we can do that before going to the questions. One last question I had for us is for all of you is really about teaching. And one of the things, I made my little strident position very clear about what I think of all this, but it strikes me that one of the criticisms of us coastal elite intellectual class people is that we're biased. And I think we go into the classroom, many of us, I think, and we strive to not be so biased, to not hit our students over the head with whatever dogmatic politics we may or may not have, or whatever our reactions to the world's news and events. We try to be objective or try to be balanced or to create space for there to be discord and dialogue. What do we do in this moment, this long January 6th moment, before and after? And I love the way you phrase that. But what do we do in this moment when, if we take a stand in defense of democratic norms, we seem to be perpetuating the very image of ourselves that's portrayed in right-wing news outlets about who we are, and that our students are also picking up and come to class with, right? So I'm wondering, do you guys have any thoughts on that? How do we handle that as teachers in this moment when to take a stand on something you seem to be just perpetuating the negative stereotype of yourself in the press, right-wing press in particular?
I'm going to come in on this one, Max. I'm going to come in from the curtains and say something. No matter what we say or do, the right-wing press is going to position us in a certain way as anti-democratic and anti-freedom. And I think it's our responsibility to continue to speak our truth as best we can, and to know that we are often very objective, and that we do try to give our students tools for reading situations that aren't simply ideological rote or boilerplate, but that we're actually interested in them as whole beings and whole citizens. What the press does with that is what the press does with that. And I think we have to live with that and do our jobs as best we can. That's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, if I can jump in here too. I mean, I think about this a lot because particularly when I was teaching in the US, and this is now 16, 17 years ago, I really tried to not let students, I left them guessing about where my politics were, and I was very careful about that. And in some ways it was easier up here in Canada because there was less at stake, talking about US political history on this side of the border. And with Trump, I decided I couldn't do that anymore. Like, I had to lay out my cards. And that then led to the question, I don't also want to shut down discussion. I want to have, right? I think the way I try to deal with this is to teach, history is complicated, to teach the complications and to raise the questions and say, yes, I think this, but here's my take, and here's some documents, and let's start digging into the questions. And how did people at the time see this, right? How do Southern slaveholders, we would say, rationalize their defense of slavery as in the American Revolutionary tradition? Let's read some of the speeches of the time where people do this and try to get into their heads. And I think, by just trying to show students it is very complicated. It is, there are lots of questions that are whirling around, just like the questions we've had in this webinar today. That's a way of saying, yes, this is my position, but I came to it a certain way, and I take this stuff very seriously, and let's start that discussion.
I thank you so much for asking that, Max, and those 2 comments were really helpful, because I'm desperate. I haven't taught for a while. I've been on leave, and I have anxiety about going into a classroom, because I have the same concern about going to a classroom that I have for our politics in large. It's like, are we at a situation where sort of it's hard to hold, where the political system is just really in a challenging moment to actually hold this sort of incredible divergence of opinions and perspectives? I mean, I do think it's truly a challenge, but I think that we are at a moment we can't get away from the fact, like, I can't even pretend to be a history teacher if I walk in the class and pretend it's ambiguous about whether or not the election was massively overrun by fraud. I couldn't even begin to construct effectively how I would narrate the example of how the election was completely fake. So I just think we're also at a point where the times have called it upon ourselves. I mean, I think it's past due. I don't intend on shaming anybody in my class, but I also can't pretend that what is not. I mean, if it's political to say that the election was fair, I don't know what else we can do. I think this, right. But I do think we have I do think this is not, this is going to be a challenge, like, full stop.
And I think it's important to resist that idea that partisanship and intellectual acuity are somehow the same. And this, so often I am called to mind, what comes to my mind is the Fox News fair and balanced slogan, right? Which, semiotic scholars have had done a lot of work with. But that idea of fair and balanced, and the real co-opting of that, and then the insistence that thoughtful and careful work is the same thing as awarding as two-sidism. And that's where I often find myself with this, is that, what voices do you give a platform to and what don't you? And in that same poll you cited, Max, the 87%, 74% of Republicans polled, and this is a poll taken in January, said that they did not believe that Biden fairly won the election. So that's a bracing fact. And I find that a kind of like a carpet almost rolls out in front of me in that moment for sort of what do you can't, I don't find that I can walk away from that reality. Now, how I'm going to walk down that carpet, I don't always know, but I try and resist that idea of partisanship.
And I just want to throw really quickly on top of that, such an important distinction that you start with. And I do think that we probably are just going to have to do what we've always done, which is we're teaching the skill of the dance between analysis and evidence, and we have like decades and decades and decades of incredible scholarship to build on, sort of how we try to organize that. And we have to, we all are constantly refining our ability to sort of build those things and build that, like that work of that dance between analysis and evidence. And that, that's how I think I'll probably present this, these discussions. Not that there's always two-sidism, but like, this is the skill that we are constantly honing.
Awesome. I think actually that's a great transition. I'm going to get into some of the questions. Samantha Parker has this question. I'm going to paraphrase it, hopefully correctly. And that is, what are the kind of implications of this, the sort of whole stolen election narrative culminating at January 6th for other lesser known elections that are coming up at the municipal and state level? Is this ideology of election fraud something that not only is going to live on at the presidential level, but as she says, is this data in American elections unique to presidential elections, or is it going to permeate future elections at the municipal and state level as well? Is this something we're going to have to deal with now going forward?
Very quickly, I will say, not only is it something we'll have to deal with going forward, it's something that we've been dealing with for, as I think Russell noted, for decades and decades. And I think that it's unquestionable that we are going to see, especially Republican-controlled legislatures, a slew of proposals to counter fraud that are going to have the effect of limiting absentee vote. I mean, all of the things that people are taking issue with. So I think not only is it, I think the most immediate thing is we're going to see a massive assault on efforts to expand the electorate and the technologies that already exist to facilitate voting. Whether or not we're going to continue to see questions of the outcomes of elections, I would suspect so, but I'm less confident about being for sure we're going to see that in every election going forward. But I think there's no question, I would imagine, that we would see a continuation of what's been going on for a long time. That this lie will be used to rationalize a host of sort of further kind of morals testing around the vote. I don't know if other people agree with that, but
just to chime in, I mean, say Republican legislators in Pennsylvania and other states are already talking about doing further limits to mail-in voting. I mean, this is already part of the discussion of what they're planning to do in the coming year. Pennsylvania in particular, which expanded mail-in voting in 2019, they want to restrict it. So this stuff is absolutely still rolling on. And I won't go too much into it, but we've already seen this at the state level in Pennsylvania, where the state Senate refused to seat, I mean, he was finally seated, but in early January refused to seat a Democratic state senator who had won an election in this 45th district. It's near Pittsburgh. His Republican opponent contested it. He won by 69 votes. She took it to federal court. He was certified, and yet the state General Assembly would not seat him and actually literally deposed Lieutenant Governor of Pennsylvania, John Fetterman, for a day and pushed him out of the chamber and elected their own Senate President pro tem to entertain the motions to basically swear in all the people, all the new General Assembly members, except for this one guy. Now, he finally was sworn in last Wednesday, but that was a mini coup right there on the floor of the General Assembly in Harrisburg. This stuff is not stopping. I mean, it will not stop until voters put their foot down and keep it from stopping, right? But yeah,
Right.
that's underway.
I want to go to another question that I think is a really important one. This is from Leanne Gomez. Hopefully I did your name right, Leanne. She says, as historians, is there an almost comical aspect to the nature of the insurrection as it was initially covered by the media? The happenings of global political uprisings, misdemeanors, governmental endeavors on global forefront are often gain ridicule and intense scrutiny from the United States. However, when faced with their own political turmoil, discourse is centered around fundamentally different approach that speaks to complexity, historical precedents, and multifaceted political undertakings. I think this is a brilliant question, and I'm going to add to it because I think what it's really about is how do we understand the way in which the coup has been portrayed in the United States versus how coups are portrayed globally, particularly in the global South?
There's an episode of a podcast, Citations Needed, with Nima Shirazi and Adam Johnson, which just looked in the aftermath of this at the really persistent media coverage, which kept saying this is like the third world, or what we're watching is what happens in a banana republic. Mm-hmm. And the idea, they really delve into the idea that which plays so much into what all of you have been saying, that America can only imagine itself as the perfect embodiment, the apex of democracy. And so then to seek models for violations of that democracy, they turn to countries which are, of course, putatively not white, right? Like it's absolutely a claim about a kind of hierarchy of imagined civilization, right? So that's one source you might go to think about that, but that is such a great question.
Well, I'll just jump in then, Russ or Julie, if you want to say something too. But I think what's struck about the question, of course, is exactly what you're saying, Alexandra, sort of hierarchy of civilization, but also in particular, sort of a forgetting, an American forgetting. Right? When we talk about banana republics or coups, or like we forget that the coup is the epitome of American foreign policy. What are we talking about? Right? So this is something that it's not foreign to the United States. Perhaps what's foreign is when we see it play out, and I think this is a really useful framing, in an almost comical way. Now, I think we need to clarify, it's comical because it didn't succeed. It's comical because we have a lot of images of idiots dressed up as Vikings. But had it succeeded, and there's a question about that in a second, which I want to get to, I think it would be different. But you have to be clear that the coup is American, right? And we have to be very careful about artificially sealing off what the US does around the world with what happens here. So I think that's a great question. Well, I want to get actually exactly to this question. It's a very interesting one. This is from Jerry Sadvari. It's a hypothetical question, and that is, if the Democrats had lost 9 more congressional seats and the January 6 protesters, quote unquote, had stayed outside of the Capitol barriers, would Congress have set aside the election and chosen their own president? Any takers on that?
I'll give it a shot. The difficulty, I mean, the thing about the objectors, Holly Cruz and company, there was never, they themselves were cynical and not serious about this because there was never an end game, right? There are no alternate slates of electors, right? I mean, even Pennsylvania did not, the legislature did not offer alternate slates of electors. So who are you going to elect? I mean, I guess the end game might be if you disqualify enough states, and Biden had 306 electoral votes. So you have to disqualify a bunch, not just Pennsylvania and Arizona, to throw it into the House. And if you throw it into the House, well, there's the issue of if the Democrats have lost the majority, you know, that's quite a billiard shot, right? To be able to hit all those balls in that direction. So I guess on the outside, technically, it might be possible. But to me, it just strikes me that for so many Republican office holders, this was a very cynical ploy to try and get base votes in 2024 without ever thinking it would happen. I don't think even, maybe some of them did, but I'm wondering to what degree some of these people were in fact surprised that a mob would actually come and go after them at the Capitol. Maybe some weren't, and that's something to be investigated. But it's a real bank shot to try and see how you would actually get a Trump victory out of this in the end, an institutional one.
I agree. I feel like I feel like so much of this, of the disruptive potential of this moment, rested in the crowd and not the institutional, this very cynical institutional movers. But but man, I'm having a hard time explaining what actually happened. So I definitely I'm hesitant to postulate what could have happened in these other ways. But I think that crowd was the sort of volatile, was the disruptive, the force that sort of had the most potential for. I don't know. I say that and then I can think up ways where I'm disagreeing with myself. So I'll.
Yeah, I would just add. I think that I think I would say I agree, Russ, with you completely, but I would caution us to remember that, again, going back to foreign policy 101, it's not always the coherent coup that works. Mm-hmm. Right? It's not always the coup that's best planned out with the most control. Sometimes it's literally you let a few crazy people in and enough people stand back to wait and see what happens. And then they don't have to partake in the coup. All they have to say is, well, now we want to step in and make sure there's some order here. We want to make sure, if you think about it, right? Why did all these corporate elites who ostensibly disagree with Trump on so many things sign up to be part of his economic policy commissions and working groups? And what they said was, well, we don't agree with him, but we thought we should have some smart minds at the table. And so I can see a scenario in which a coup happens that seems completely outrageous and we're all like baffled and surprised and laughing at it. And then we get to a moment where people say, well, we just want to have a transition period, or let's just hold off on the election of Joe Biden for a little bit and see what happens. And I hesitate to say that because I know it starts to veer into the conspiratorial, but I guess what I'm saying is historically, many coups have started just like that. They haven't always been completely well planned out.
Let me just, if I can jump in here very quickly, but I think and I've been thinking about this for a while, but it gets to the point also of the notion of, quote, banana republic, unquote. And I think in some ways what happened January 6th may hopefully destabilize notions of American exceptionalism that Americans tend to hang on to, right? You know, we are the shining city on the hill on this stuff. But as with many coups, it ends up coming down to what will the army do? And I think the real question, you know, there's a wonderful, there's a Rosa Brooks who used to work in the Defense Department, and then she teaches, I think it's at Georgetown. This past summer ran essentially a war game of what would happen if Trump contested the election with a bunch of different parties. I think Radiolab did a great podcast on this. It was really chilling. But the conclusion people came to at the very end of the day was who the president is at the end of the day on January 20th is that person to whom the Joint Chiefs of Staff hand the nuclear codes. Who they think the president is who the president is, right? It's a Weberian definition of the state, who has the, you know, monopoly of legitimate means of violence, right? And that's it. It's the army. So I think our questions and our speculation here come down to what would they do? I tend to think they give the codes to Biden. I think they will on January 20th. But that's the crux of it. That's the question. That's the point to ask, where would this end up, I think.
And I like that. I think the question too about the figure of comedy, like the unserious, and how, which protests, right? Because there are people who are articulating this as a protest, which protests are taken seriously as a threat, right? Like a bodily threat, a threat to property, a threat to the state, a threat to the citizens' security. And I'm thinking here about not just the revolution, right, and the models there of how the mantle of righteous protest was kind of taken on, but also how figures of fun, like the Viking figure, echo through the student anti-Vietnam protests as well. The idea of like the long hair or the flower, the use of the flowers, even the use of something like the die-in. So how particular forms of protest are either legitimated or delegitimated as comic or figures of ridicule, and then how public force and the military force that Russ is pointing us towards gets mobilized. What is the point at which the figure of fun or ridicule shifts into becoming a threat to the state? What is the point at which a crowd becomes a mob? And I think tracing through some of those representations could be really useful for us in this moment.
also sort of who even has the figure of fund to be available. I mean, I think that there was a lot of playfulness in sort of Black Lives Matter protests, but it just simply is not, it was just outside of the bounds of seeing that as, it's just inherently threatening, in part because of which bodies are doing it. I also think this conversation, the sort of metaphor of coup, I think is very, I mean, not metaphor, not necessarily a metaphor in this case, but the word of coup is also interesting in the sense that it gestures toward this foreign antecedent or echo, or when I've been curious that Reconstruction and hasn't been more of a sort of metaphor in us trying to understand the possibilities here. Not to say that like a coup in a sort of more kind of the way that we think of it as something foreign, it wouldn't necessarily be possible. But to me, I'm much more scared of, that's the reality that I see as more like the sort of violent disenfranchisement of certain groups of people, sort of in the name of democracy, of a particular vision of who are the people and who deserves to be who deserves to be represented and served by the state. So I've been curious, and I know we're running out of time, but I feel like this is where scholars of the Civil War and Reconstruction are really important, and I think actually have. That's a powerful sort of antecedent that challenges our idea of like the long moral arc heading up in our sort of narrative of American history, but also is a way of showing that like the polity is always kind of shrinking and expanding and being not the polity, but the sort of like who we view as the legitimate people is constantly being massaged and sort of violently throughout American history. And so I think that is a sort of that is a vehicle through which to think this moment also, in addition to this language of coup. I don't know if people see that also.
Also, just to follow up on that, a 13-year period where the Republican Party had unequivocal clarity about treason, right? They were unequivocal. It was a party born, right, in conceptualizing expanded democracy through the curtailing of slavery's expansion. It was the party that staked its ground on not breaking the Union apart over the issue of slavery and willing to go to war to defend it. And it was the party that continued to occupy the South for 7 years in order to attempt Reconstruction. And they were defeated from within and from without, but it was a heroic moment for the Republican Party, which looks nothing like the Republican Party of our own moment. So Reconstruction, redemption as an antecedent, but also Reconstruction, to my mind, as a possible antecedent to another way forward. Right, of go back to my point, using a state, if we can get power over it, to, in a democratic and peaceful way, redistribute wealth, expand democracy, do what they did in the New Deal, introduce social citizenship. So I think you're right. The Reconstruction era offers both kind of ominous warnings of what could come and potential alternatives. Just want to jump to one last, I know it's go, I just want to get one, I'll do 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up. I just want to get these 2 questions out there. Real quick. One is from Lewis Reedwood. Broadly, it's about the relationship between emotion and right-wing activism. And the relationship, he's interested if we have any thoughts on the relationship between the history of emotions and radical conservative politics. I think that's a really important thing, question to ask. And then the other one I just want to get to, I'm sorry for those who I'm missing, but this is from Megan Henderson. And it says, I've heard many suggest that the only solution to Trumpism is to, quote, meet in the middle and have conversations with those who have moved to the right. But this is difficult because they have no willingness to concede, even when there's no evidence or fact or rationality behind it. And it's also asking, Black and Indigenous people of color and others to compromise on the question of their human rights in order to get back to a normal. So what do we do politically? I think that's a really important question. So we could end with those 2 before we wrap up. But this question of emotion and the conservative politics, and then what do we do with the 75 million, 74 million?
I think the emotion question has been a question that has framed the Trump era. And this is where we start to slip into being able to talk about demagoguery, right? A kind of politics that appeals to feeling and to affect, that it doesn't make you think, it makes you feel. And the way you feel is powerful enough that you are convinced by it above everything else. And the public deployment of, not in Trump exactly a silver tongue, but simply a willingness to say things that had not been said. It was like an expansion of what was publicly possible to say, not so much a kind of skilled oratory, right? So that's how I'm thinking about feeling and affect and the Trump era, is in terms of how Trump articulated that through demagogic, patterns and tropes, and then how that echoes with such deep resonance that it seems to have overcome. It feels more true than the fact that Joe Biden won the election.
Russ or Julilly, any thoughts on either of those two questions?
I have a thought, if I might. Max, and forgive me, Russ and Julilly. This takes me back to your answer to Samantha's question, and a reminder that democracy is struggle on the one hand, and that it's not simply at the federal level. So it's really important at the local and state levels to be organizing and pushing. And I'm thinking now about some of the efforts to elect more progressive district attorneys that's been happening, St. Louis, Philadelphia being two examples, and the interesting pushback from the non-elected district attorneys against the person who's elected to try to reform their departments, and the need of the populace to support the people that they put in office. So it's doing the kind of structural groundwork, which actually the Republicans have been doing for generations and the Democrats have kind of neglected, honestly. That needs to be, to me, the next step forward in terms of really not finding a middle ground, but making our ground more stable underneath in order to move forward policies that we find reflect the will of all people, not just certain people. Thank you.
Yeah, if I can chime in just very briefly. I mean, yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this because it's a real problem of frankly, the legitimacy of the state, right? And that's a key problem for the state, I think, and the republic. I do think, how do you disenthrall people of a delusion? It's helpful that Twitter cut Trump's account because that was the main, that was his radio tower for broadcasting the delusion. I think people need to be held to account. I think that goes from people who broke into the Capitol on all the way up to Trump. And it's in the holding to account and basically pursuing what the stories were of that day in part, that if there's any hope for minds to be changed, maybe it's there. I don't know how optimistic I can be, but certainly there's been a lot of talk even within Congress that the video that got shot that day is actually worse than what we saw, that there's a lot worse going on than what has been made public so far. And maybe in the process of depositions and indictments and then trials, we'll begin to see some of that. I don't know. But I think the notion that we should have some kind of, reconciliation commission, you can't have reconciliation without some accountability. I think, and we've had 4 years without it, and I don't see a way to proceed forward without that.
And just to go back again to this question of Civil War and Reconstruction, right? Lincoln and the Republicans in Congress, particularly the radical Republicans, got told over and over again, give up this pesky little issue of Black citizenship, give up this issue of having a constitutional amendment against slavery, give up these things. And what they demonstrated in that moment, and none of us know if we'll have the courage or capacity to do it when our time comes, but what they demonstrated was exactly what Russ just said. An unwillingness to bend on certain questions and a willingness to bend on the other questions to help bring the nation back together. And I don't know how they did it. I don't envy them having to do it, but we have to be able to be clear about where we're not going to bend. And that, doesn't mean that our job, I think, if we actually want to build something new, is punitive and vengeful. Accountability is not necessarily vengeful, although maybe speaking for myself, I've had those feelings. When I listened to AOC's experience in the Capitol, I felt very personally, emotionally affronted by that. And, but that's not politics. That's a personal reaction. Politics has to be about where do we draw the line and hold people accountable, but also where do we give millions of people who've made a very poor decision in supporting this anti-democratic movement a chance to rehabilitate themselves in a different way. And it's not going to happen overnight, and we're not going to like all of them, and we're not going to like talking to all of them, but I do think that work has to be done. How we do it, I don't know. But I'll say, though, there are people doing that work right now. I think there are, at the grassroots level, organizations and activists that are trying to, think of folks like William Barber in North Carolina, other places that are trying to build coalitions that can speak to a broad cross-section of American population, many of whom disagree on things like gun rights or abortion or other things, but you can find ways to kind of build consensus. And that's the heroic work of our generation, I think, our time.
I completely agree. I was thinking that when you guys were all talking, I think we need to face that the meaning of these events doesn't exist yet, that it will be created in the following months and years, in part through what the consequences are for these actions, that it will become, was it a bunch of silly people that had cool hats, and they were, a couple of them got out of control? Was it a treason? Was it, that's what's crazy and interesting about this current moment, is that part of why we have a hard time with the take is, as historians, I think we all realize the event has yet to be actually created. Like it will, over the following months, it will be created, and it will be a struggle, no less than the struggle that we saw to define what it was and what it means. And I think we're all, this is sort of one part of that struggle. And I think that going forward, the path is not to meet people necessarily, to sort of agree, like let's give away half of our sort of vision of reality, but actually to build a social basis for a different politics. I think this is what you were leaning towards. Like, we can't just assume that because there's tens of thousands of people who don't have healthcare and who, or who's like, or watching their grandparents die in sort of horrible ways, that we inherently can sort of have a path forward. Like, I think there needs to be, we need to recognize that there needs to be sort of a social collective that actually has to be built. And it's on the basis of that a different politics will be built forward, not necessarily by sort of having reports about the number of actual fraudulent votes. Like, I think that if just claiming that, like, this is a lie over and over again remade our political universe, I think it would have worked already, and it hasn't. So I'm not saying we shouldn't point out a lie. I'm just saying that I think that the task before us is greater than that, as Max and everyone has sort of gestured to.
And just to fit, perhaps the other thing that happened next to, alongside January 6th insurrection, of course, was that you have the election in Georgia, which for the first time, right, we have an African-American senator in Georgia, of all places, and the Democrats, it's a blue state from the Senate. That's crazy, but it's not the whims of the political moment that did that. It was organizing that did that. That's what won that. And so I think perhaps the other legacy of January 6th is not so much what that event is, you're right, what it will mean, and we have to be clear about what it means and the significance in developing that, but also not forgetting that there were other stories coming out in January that offered a different vision of what America could look like from very unsuspecting places. Anyone have any last thoughts, or should we wrap it up there?
I think that's a good place to land.
All right. Thank you guys so much for this illuminating conversation. And thank you for everyone who joined us. And I'm sorry I didn't get to everyone's questions. Thank you for those people whose questions we did get to. And hopefully this is but the beginning of a conversation where we try to make sense of what happened and what is happening, not the endpoint.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Max. And thanks, everybody.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Max.
And let's not be strangers. Let's keep talking.